My name is Ethan, and I've been a truck driver for over 15 years. I've seen it all on the road. Animals crossing in the middle of the night, horrible accidents, and even people trying to hitchhike in the most unlikely places. I never paid much attention to the stories other drivers told at stops, ghosts, cursed roads, and other nonsense. But one night, driving along a deserted stretch of Route 66, something happened that changed my life forever. I was in the middle of a long haul, hauling a load of appliances to a warehouse in Arizona. It was late at night, and the only things lighting the road were the headlights of my truck and the occasional glow of the full moon. The radio was playing a soft classic rock station, and the silence of the desert was almost comforting. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road next to a small rusty pole with a barely readable license plate. She was wearing a white dress that looked like it was from another time, something you'd expect to see in an old movie. Her dark hair fell in messy cascades over her shoulders, and she slowly raised her arm, signaling for me to stop. For a moment, I considered driving on. It wasn't uncommon to see strangers trying to hitchhike, and most of the time, it was safer not to get involved. But something about the way she stood, almost motionless, made me uncomfortable. I slowed down and parked the truck a few feet away from her. "Do you need help?" I asked, rolling down the window. She didn't answer right away. She just walked up to the passenger side, her steps slow and silent. When she got close enough, I noticed that her eyes were large and dark, almost without reflection. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice soft, almost melodious. I hesitated for a moment, but then I unlocked the door. She climbed into the truck with precise movements, sitting in the passenger seat. Her dress was slightly dirty, as if she had been walking for a long time. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Straight ahead," she replied without looking at me. Starting the engine again, I started driving. The silence inside the cabin was oppressive, interrupted only by the sound of tires on the road. "What were you doing out here alone in the middle of nowhere?" I ventured, trying to break the awkward atmosphere. "Just looking for a way," she said, without going into details. As we drove on, I realized something was wrong. The radio started emitting static and the GPS went dark as if it had lost signal. "Damn GPS," I muttered, tapping the device. The woman didn't seem to notice any of this. She just stared straight ahead as if she knew exactly where we were going. "Do you believe in destiny?" she asked suddenly, taking me by surprise. "I guess so. I mean, everything happens for a reason, doesn't it?" She smiled slightly but didn't answer. Her smile gave me chills. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I realized something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't there. I could clearly see the empty bench where she should have been sitting, but nothing else. I swallowed hard, trying not to lose control. "So, where do you want to get off?" I asked, my voice shaking a little. She pointed vaguely ahead to a dark, deserted area where the road seemed to disappear into the horizon. "Right there," she said. My breathing was heavy, and the discomfort was almost unbearable. Something inside me screamed to stop the truck and send her away. But before I could decide what to do, I realized that the landscape around us didn't change. It was as if we were stuck on the same stretch of road, with the same rocks, the same dry bushes passing by over and over again. When I looked at the dashboard, the digital clock was frozen. "This isn't right," I muttered, feeling a chill run up my spine. The woman finally turned to me. Her eyes now seemed deeper, like two pools of darkness. "There's no turning back on every road, Ethan." I froze. How did she know my name? Before I could say anything, the headlights went out for a moment, and when they came back on, the woman was gone. The truck's cabin was empty, but the smell of wilted flowers lingered in the air. The woman had disappeared, but the discomfort she had brought had not. The truck's cabin was cold. The smell of wilted flowers lingered, and the silence around me was absolute. I glanced again in the rearview mirror, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain what had just happened. But there was nothing. Just the emptiness of the road behind me. I took a deep breath and kept driving. Part of me wanted to believe that it was all due to fatigue, a trick of my mind after so many hours behind the wheel. But as I drove down the road, I realized that something was terribly wrong. The GPS remained off, and the radio emitted a low static. Even more worrying, the landscape around me seemed stuck in time. The same rocks, the same bushes, the same shadows. It was like driving on an endless loop. That's when I saw her again. She was in the middle of the road, a few meters away, standing still as if she had never left. Her hair swayed slightly in the wind, but the rest of her body was still. "It can't be," I whispered, gripping the steering wheel. This time I didn't stop. I accelerated, determined to get through that vision. But when the headlights reached her, the light seemed to pass through her as if it were made of smoke. My heart raced, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, there she was again, stopped in the middle of the road, closer than before. I stopped the truck abruptly, the engine roaring before going silent. I needed to understand what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight and got out of the vehicle, the cold night air cutting into my skin. When I turned back to the road, she was no longer there. I took a few steps forward, shining the flashlight into nothingness. That's when I noticed something on the side of the road. An old, rusty car with broken windows and a dented roof. It looked like it had been there for decades, but the tire tracks around it were fresh. I approached the car cautiously. Inside, I saw a picture frame lying face down on the driver's seat. I picked it up and wiped the dirty glass with my hands. My blood ran cold when I saw the photo. It was the woman who had gotten into my truck. All around the car were belongings scattered about: clothes, shoes, purses. It was as if someone had emptied a trunk in a hurry. Among the objects, I found several identity cards. I flipped through them, and each one belonged to a missing person, all dated within the last 20 years. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight, but I saw nothing, just the empty road. "You're staying here too." Her voice came soft, almost like a whisper in the wind. The flashlight flickered and went out. The air around me grew heavy, and a low sound began to grow. Footsteps, voices, something scraping against the asphalt. Then I realized I was no longer alone. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, men and women in torn clothing, their faces pale and empty. They moved slowly toward me, forming a circle. "Fate chooses who stays," the woman's voice said again. There she was, standing in the middle of the circle, her face now distorted into something that was not human. Her eyes, once dark, glowed with an intense, almost hypnotic light. I tried to run, but the figures blocked my path. I felt cold hands grip my arms and legs, pulling me to the ground. My screams echoed through the night, but were soon drowned out by the sound of static, the same sound that had come from the truck's radio. The last thing I saw was the woman's face leaning over me, her expression now a mix of sadness and pleasure. "Welcome to the road, Ethan." Days later, my truck was found parked on the same stretch of Route 66, with the engine still running and the doors locked. On the passenger seat was a dried rose and a handwritten note: "No one escapes the road." The documents found at the scene added to the already long history of unexplained disappearances on that part of the highway. No one could explain what happened to me, but other drivers reported seeing a female figure on the following nights, always waving to passers-by. And so, the road continues to take its toll. My name is Clara, and since I was little, I have always been fascinated by mystery. Maybe it was the effect of the fantasy and suspense books I devoured, or maybe it was something deeper, a curiosity that never seemed satisfied. It was this curiosity that took me to New Orleans, a city full of stories, legends, and places that seemed to come from another world. I was looking for inspiration for a photography exhibition about historical places. The theme of the exhibition was Silences of the Past, and New Orleans seemed perfect. Between the narrow streets, the old mansions, and the echoes of voodoo culture, something about that city attracted me like a magnet. It was one sunny afternoon while talking to a tour guide that I heard about the Cemetery of Eternal Night. According to him, it was a place avoided even by the bravest residents. "They say it was built on cursed ground," explained the guide with a somber expression. "Black magic practices, sacrifices, things that no one likes to talk about." That only piqued my curiosity. a place full of history and atmosphere, perfect for my photos. I ignored the warnings and decided to visit it before sunset. The cemetery was located far from the city center, surrounded by tall trees and worn stone walls. The entrance was marked by a rusty iron gate, with the name engraved in barely legible letters. As soon as I passed through the gate, I felt a chill, despite the heat of the day. The place was unlike anything I had ever seen. Ornate tombs, crypts that looked like small houses, and statues that seemed to watch whoever passed by. The silence was profound, interrupted only by the occasional sound of the wind blowing through the trees. I began taking photos, fascinated by the details of the tombstones and the Latin inscriptions. Many of them were covered in moss, but some had strange symbols that I could not identify. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, the cemetery seemed to change. The shadows lengthened, and the golden light made the environment even more surreal. It was then that I noticed something strange. As I adjusted the focus of the camera, I saw a figure in the background, between two crypts. It was a tall figure, dressed in black, motionless as a statue. "Hello?" I called, but received no response. When I lowered the camera, the figure had disappeared. I felt a shiver, but I kept taking pictures. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps a visitor. But the uneasiness grew with each passing minute. A little later, I heard a sound. It was low, almost imperceptible, like a child's laughter, coming from somewhere to my left. I turned my head quickly, but saw no one. I kept walking, faster now, trying to find the exit. When I reached the main gate, my heart stopped. It was locked. I was sure I had left it open. I pulled hard on the rusty iron, but it didn't budge. "It can't be," I muttered, feeling the panic growing. I looked around, searching for another exit, but the cemetery seemed denser, as if the space had been compressed. The trees, once distant, now seemed closer, their shadows forming intricate patterns on the ground. It was then that I saw him again. The figure in black was standing a few feet away from me, between two tall tombstones. This time he moved, slowly, as if floating, disappearing behind a crypt. "Hey!" I shouted, more to dispel my fear than to get an answer. I ran toward him, but when I turned the corner of the crypt, there was no one. Just absolute silence. When I looked back, I saw something that made me freeze. The tombstones around me were different. The names engraved on them were no longer unfamiliar. Instead, they were filled with familiar dates, birth and death dates that corresponded to people in my family. And in the center of it all, a tombstone with my name engraved on it. The sound of laughter echoed again, but this time it seemed to come from all sides. My breath caught in my chest as I stared at the headstone with my name engraved on it. The date of death was marked as today. I blinked, hoping it was some kind of mistake or illusion. But when I touched the cold surface of the stone, I felt the clear indentation of the letters. The laughter returned, louder this time, echoing throughout the cemetery. It was a macabre sound, one that didn't seem human. The shadows around me began to move. Trees that had previously seemed motionless now swayed, as if invisible winds were blowing through them. Suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly and saw him, the figure in black. He was closer now, and I could make out details that had previously been invisible. His face was cadaverous, with sunken eyes that glowed red. He wasn't walking. He glided along the ground as if unbound by the laws of this world. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a long, bony hand, pointing to something behind me. When I turned, I saw one of the crypts open by itself, with a loud scraping sound of stone against stone. Inside the dark interior, something glowed faintly, as if calling to me. "No," I mumbled, stepping back. But it was too late. My legs began to move on their own, carrying me toward the open crypt. No matter how hard I struggled, it was as if an invisible force was pushing me forward. The interior of the crypt was cold and damp, and the smell of earth and decay was unbearable. In the center was a stone pedestal, upon which rested an ancient book. Its pages were open, and strange symbols were engraved on them, pulsing in a blood-red hue. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. The words made no sense, but there was something about them that felt familiar, as if they were being written as I read them. One sentence in particular made me freeze. The sacrifice must be complete for the gate to remain closed. Before I could process what it meant, I felt the ground shake. I looked back and saw that the figure had entered the crypt. He was closer now, his eyes glowing brightly. "You have opened the way, Clara," he said, his voice like muffled thunder. I tried to run, but I stumbled and fell to the ground. He approached slowly, and the shadows around him seemed to melt into him, making him even more imposing. "What do you want from me?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. "It's not what I want. It's what they want." He pointed to the entrance of the crypt, where other figures began to emerge. There were many of them. Men, women, and children, all pale and haggard with empty eyes and crooked smiles. They whispered my name over and over like a chant. "You are the sacrifice, Clara, the price to keep the veil between the worlds." I tried to scream, but my voice was drowned out by a sudden wind that filled the crypt. The figure raised its hands and an invisible force lifted me off the ground, holding me in the air. I felt something cold and sharp press against my chest, and a sharp pain shot through my body. My vision began to darken, but before it was over, I saw the figure leaning toward me, its eyes burning with a triumphant glow. Welcome to the eternal night. The next morning, New Orleans residents reported hearing screams and laughter coming from the cemetery throughout the night. When authorities went to investigate, they found the gate open and scratch marks on the headstones as if something had gotten out. Clara's camera was found in one of the crypts. Her last photos showed humanoid shadows and the figure in black staring directly into the lens with a cadaverous smile. She was never seen again. But ever since that night, it is said that laughter and whispers can be heard in the cemetery, especially at sunset. And for the bravest who enter, there is always a new tombstone with a name engraved on it that no one recognizes. I've always been fascinated by forgotten places. There's something inexplicable about exploring ruins, hearing the stories that the weathered walls whisper. My name is Jake, and together with my girlfriend Emma, I dedicate my weekends to exploring abandoned places and documenting them in photos and videos. Our latest discovery took us to Florida, to the most eerie place we've ever encountered, Encanto Park. The park opened in the 1970s and was a popular destination for families, but a devastating fire closed it just a few years later. Many say the flames consumed more than just wood and plastic. They took souls, leaving something dark behind. We arrived at the park at dusk. The sun was still casting golden rays, but the shadows of the tall trees around it made the place seem plunged into darkness. The main gate was fallen down, overgrown with weeds, and the rusty sign barely made the words Encanto Park legible. "Sounds perfect for an epic video," Emma said, adjusting her camera. I nodded, but there was something in the air. A faintly sweet smell mixed with the metallic odor of rust that made me uneasy. We walked in. The first thing we saw was the Ferris wheel. It was tilted, its cabins dangling from broken chains, as if a strong wind might topple it at any moment. Beside it, overgrown carousels seemed buried in time, and roller coaster tracks poked out of the undergrowth. "Look at that!" Emma exclaimed, pointing to a cotton candy stand. Inside was a machine that looked like it had been used yesterday, with dried bits of cotton candy still stuck to the sides. "Strange," I muttered, running my hand over the machine. It was too clean for something that should have been abandoned for decades. As we walked deeper into the park, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew heavier, and the silence was broken by a faint but recognizable sound, the melody of a carousel. "Jake, are you hearing that?" Emma asked, looking around. I was. The sound was coming from far away, but it shouldn't have. There was no electricity in the park, and besides, the carousel we'd seen was completely destroyed. We followed the melody, our flashlights illuminating the way. We reached the center of the park, where a rusty control booth was partially hidden under a fallen tree. Inside, we found papers, tools, and a diary. The pages were yellowed but legible. The first few pages told of the park's construction and its early years of success. But as we progressed, the tone changed. One entry caught my eye. The shadows appear after sunset. They don't speak, but I hear them. Something is wrong here, but no one believes me. I kept reading. The last few pages described rides running on their own, children's voices where there were no others, and shadowy figures wandering between attractions. The author wrote shortly before the fire, "The park never wanted to let anyone go. The souls that enter here are his." Emma read over my shoulder, and her expression changed from curiosity to fear. "I think we should go, Jake," she said, her voice low. I nodded, but as we stepped out of the booth, I realized something was wrong. The sound of the carousel was louder now, and dim lights were flickering in the distance, illuminating the Ferris wheel. "That's not possible," I murmured, pulling Emma closer. She pointed toward the entrance to the park. The gates, which had been down when we arrived, were now upright and locked with chains. The park seemed to be waking up. The Ferris wheel spun slowly, emitting a high-pitched metallic sound that tore through the silence. The lights that flashed in faded colors made no sense. There was no electricity in the park. Emma grabbed my arm, her pale face reflecting the fear I felt. "Jake, we need to get out of here," she said, her voice barely audible over the booming music of the carousel. We made it to the gates, but they were locked with thick chains that hadn't been there when we arrived. I tried to force them, but it was useless. I looked around looking for another way out, but the park seemed to have changed. The paths we had taken were different, as if the rides had moved. Suddenly, the sound of the carousel stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, looking back. Before I could answer, footsteps echoed in the distance, as if someone was running between the rides. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound, but all I saw were shadows moving too fast to be human. "Jake," Emma began, but her voice trailed off. I followed her gaze and saw something that chilled me to the bone. Near the Ferris wheel, a figure stood. He was dressed like a clown, but the costume was dirty and torn. His face, partially covered by a faded mask, seemed twisted into a grotesque smile. He didn't move, but I knew he was watching us. "Come on, now!" I pulled Emma by the hand, trying to get us away from there. We ran aimlessly, passing stalls and rides, but the park seemed endless. Every corner took us back to places we had already been, as if we were trapped in a maze. The music came back, but this time it came from all sides, as if the entire park was alive. A mechanical sound mixed with the melody, and I realized that the roller coaster was working. Their rusty cars moved along the tracks by themselves, and children's voices echoed, laughing and shouting, but there was no one there. Emma stumbled and fell beside me. As I helped her up, I noticed something in her hand. She had found a piece of paper on the floor, crumpled and dirty. I unfolded it and saw a list of names written in shaky handwriting. At the bottom, the last two names were ours, Jake Mitchell and Emma Carter. "This can't be," I whispered, feeling panic overcome me. Emma began to cry. "Jake, they knew we would be here." Before we could think of another way out, the sound of footsteps came again, closer this time. Shadows began to form around us, and indistinct figures emerged from the rides. They were children, or what was left of them. Their faces were distorted, and their eyes glowed with a dull hue. They began to walk toward us slowly, as if they were surrounding us. The clown appeared again, this time closer. His grotesque grin widened, and he pointed toward the Ferris wheel, now spinning faster. "This way!" I yelled, pulling Emma toward a game booth. We hid behind the counter, trying to control our breathing. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that looked like a key hanging from a nail. I grabbed it, hoping it was the key to the gates. "We need to get back to the entrance," I whispered. Emma nodded, and we ran as fast as we could. The figures began to move faster, their screams and laughter filling the air. We reached the gates, and I tried to fit the key into the lock. My heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. The key turned. The chains fell with a crash, and the gates began to open. But before we could get out, Emma screamed. I looked back and saw that she was being pulled. One of the childlike figures had grabbed her leg, and the others were closing in, dragging her back. "No!" I ran to her, trying to free her, but the shadows were too strong. Emma looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "Go, Jake, get out of here." "I won't leave you," I screamed, but the shadows swallowed her completely. I stood still for a moment, unable to process what had happened. Then, I felt something touch my shoulder. I turned and saw the clown, his eyes now glowing brightly. I ran. I ran as fast as I could through the gates and throwing myself onto the deserted road. Days later, I found the strength to go back with the police, but the park was no longer there. The place was empty, covered in trees and vegetation, as if the park had never existed. The only thing left was the diary we found, now with 2 more names added to the list: Jake Mitchell and Emma Carter. And every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the carousel music.